All right, hello everyone. So, broadening financial inclusion, what does that mean? I'm excited to explore what it means to broaden financial inclusion in different contexts with this amazing panel. Keep your questions in mind for the Q&A session towards the end. All right, so let's meet our panel. I think most people here are probably familiar with our panelists. They're all past or current grantees. Erica Hargreave is a storyteller and an educator who has been working towards identifying and sharing different pathways to sustainably funding projects for social good, both for her own projects and to share with her students and other digital creatives. She is also pleased to be a past grantee and current ambassador for the Interledger Foundation, focused on educating others about web monetization, building an engaging community, and doing outreach on Interledger into Indigenous communities and disability communities. This is a space and community that she loves and feels passionate about. She also really appreciates this community. As someone with disabilities, it has been an incredibly healthy community for her to work, experiment, and engage within. Welcome, Erica. We also have lovely Victoria Coker here with us today. She's a multidisciplined artist, software engineer, and entrepreneur. She graduated from St. John's University with a bachelor's in communication arts. Ms. Coker has more than 10 years of design and marketing experience and has worked for organizations such as Carnegie Hall, Brick Arts Media, and Oxford University Press. In 2017, she launched the Black Web Fest, an organization dedicated to celebrating Black creatives and digital content. Her goal is to build a legacy to empower her community. Welcome, Victoria. And welcome, Andres Arroz. He's the General Director of the People's Clearinghouse in Mexico. He has an economics PhD in payment systems and was a former COO of Ecuador's central bank. Andres has worked in research, policy, and practice with the rural cooperative financial sector in Ecuador. Welcome, Andres.
Yeah.
Last and of course not least, Carl Carter. He's the founder and CEO of Snake Nation. Carl is a passionate entrepreneur with 20 plus years of expertise in social change, entertainment, innovation, creative, marketing, media platforms, and strategic growth.
That's a mouthful.
He leads a team of dedicated creators, technologists, producers, strategists, influencers, and project managers in 7 countries that are galvanized by Snake Nation's mission to impact the lives of millions of diverse creators and coders globally. Welcome, Carl. And I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Sharon. I'm a software developer, and I'm also a previous grantee. Elliot in the audience over there, and I worked on the Akita project. And really, I'm always hoping to feel like I'm learning something new, whether it's in tech, exploring new spaces, skills, or problem areas. So when I thought about financial inclusion, I realized I only know what it means to me and my narrow view of how to work on this. And we have so many great panelists here today who work on it and tackle it from so many different angles. So what does financial inclusion really mean? And I'm hoping for us to explore that today. So to get started, I'm going to ask the question, what does financial inclusion mean to you? And I'll start with Andres.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thanks to Interledger for having us here as well. Really, the financial inclusion is the purpose of our entire project. And when I think of financial inclusion, I think about our boss, the president of the Mexican Association of Credit Unions of the Social Sector, Isabel Cruz, who has been working 30 years in financial inclusion issues. And the most interesting about that is she hasn't been working, with the credit card companies or with big corporate banks, but with the most marginalized people, especially rural indigenous communities in Mexico, that somehow, even in their most precarious conditions, have their own community banks, decide that they should, save their money and invest it in their own communities, even if it's very, very little amounts of money. And what we need to think about what financial inclusion is has to do with empowering those initiatives of people, especially communities and marginalized communities, on how they can use technology, finance, knowledge, networks, and connections to have those small institutions become instruments at the service of their own communities. So that's what we are doing, and that's what we've been doing for decades as the Mexican Association. Also on my side, when I worked at the central bank, we said, how do we build on top of these initiatives that are worthwhile in communities? And we gave them access to the central bank payment system. And that really democratizes access to money, democratizes the fact that they can now reinvest their own money in their own communities. So to synthesize, basically, I think financial inclusion is about empowering local communities.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, that's something that I think has been really interesting to learn about, is what the local contexts are and how do you work with them and understand their situation and connect them to broader systems. So thank you. Next, I'll have Victoria. What does financial inclusion mean to you?
Yeah, for me, financial inclusion really looks like home ownership and fair loans. And I say that because in America, there's a big wealth gap that impacts Black and brown people, right? Me being Black, it's something that impacts me, impacts my family, my friends. And to kind of bridge that wealth gap, one of the things that is said is that home ownership, you can do that with home ownership. That's how you can build generational wealth. But America has a long history of excluding Black and brown people from home ownership through redlining. So how do we work towards gaining those opportunities? Really, it's about economic justice for me, and that's the work that I'm trying to do. Even though I do a lot of things with innovation and arts, I'm really working towards economic justice and allowing people to have home ownership, get fair loans, and build generational wealth.
Awesome, thanks, Victoria. I think it's easy to forget how something that a lot of people struggle with, there's still people who struggle in very different ways, and being able to understand that and figure out ways to bridge those solutions. Thank you. Next, I'll have Erica comment on what financial inclusion means to you.
So a good portion of it for me is access. So whether that's access to the digital wallets or that's access to the internet to be able to share and build in that way. And with that, as you were speaking on with home ownership, for me, that's also access to education. And so, because I think in that having access to education allows people to start out on an even footing. This is a very Canadian thing of me, but that also goes with on starting on an even footing is access to healthcare and the ability to, if something happens to you, to be able to have people help you to get well enough to be able to move forward again, or to give you the tools to be able to move forward. And I'd also sort of add to that piece with financial inclusion as well is seeing representation that shows you that this is a space for you as well as for that other person.
Awesome, yeah. And you'll touch upon this later, but just being able to reach underserved communities and understand their contexts and the stop points along the way that you can support them. And Carl, what does financial inclusion mean to you?
I think sort of at-large financial inclusion to me is about equity. How do we, have people, participate in systems in ways that are fair and just? I approach this work as a creator, as an entrepreneur, and so I tend to look at it through that lens. And so, for example, coming out of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, Citi did a study to say, well, what's actually the cost of systemic racism to the American economy? And the cost to GDP for Black and brown entrepreneurs not having access to capital is in the trillions. Right? And so as a country, we've kind of made a decision to say, hey, we're willing to forego trillions of dollars in GDP in lieu of making sure that Black and brown communities don't have equity in the economy. And so when you start to look at the creative economy at large, which is a $2.2 trillion annual economy, which Black and brown people are largely shut out of. So like you have talent that are actors and so forth, amplifiers, but when you get into who's actually owning the IP and who owns the platforms, then that's largely white male dominated. And so I think being on the continent, we moved to Africa in 2015. You really see like a lot of dynamic change happening there, but you're also entering an environment where 80% are like roughly unbanked, and around 30% here in the States when you talk about Black and brown communities. And so there's a lot of gaps there that are happening when you talk about the ability to earn, the ability to have access to capital, and then of course the ability to participate in traditional financial systems. And so I feel like it's that lack of participation that makes people ripe to adopt, right? New technologies. So oftentimes Black and brown communities are early adopters of technology and fintech in particular because they're not wed to legacy systems, because legacy systems have failed them traditionally. And so I look at equity as like the lens through which we think about financial inclusion. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider when you're building new things and new spaces, reflecting on all the traditional systems that are there and why they don't work and who that they've excluded, and really using that to advise how to move forward. Awesome. All right, so back to you, Erica. I touched on this briefly, but you work with some underrepresented groups, and how do you identify and reach marginalized groups?
So I think a lot of that is about listening. So like one of the things that I've been kind of exploring in recent years, I had a couple car accidents about a decade ago that kind of left me living in chronic pain and dealing with all sorts of new disabilities. And as I sort of started to build myself, find my footing and my way forward and my way of managing everything again, my creative partner wanted me to start sharing that journey out there. And so I know for me, like, part of me is like I've always had disabilities, but like they were like things like dyslexia, and so I didn't really sort of I didn't previously sort of understand the inner workings of that community, and so first of all I started to learn about that, learn deeper about that community, learn about the languages that in ways that people within that community identify and how they speak about their disabilities and about ableism and those various elements. But also then realizing that within that community there are so many different voices and so many different perspectives that I could never stand up and represent everybody and everybody's story within that community. So in order to really properly reach those communities, you need to invite different people from those communities into that conversation and to share and to build together. So right now I've started to look at ways that microgrants could be created for both the disabilities and for the indigenous communities. But in order to do that properly, I can't really sit down and write the ideas that I think that will work for two different sets of microgrants for those communities because I don't understand everything that all those different communities and individuals are facing. So it's about finding out there other people who are engaged in that space, who are involved in connecting with others in that community, and inviting them to the table to have those conversations so that we can map out as best we can what's the best way to serve those communities. And so one of the beauties with the internet now is some of that we can start to figure out through social listening and through finding different communities online to begin engaging with. And then finding people within those spaces that are helping to that are trying to do social good and helping to connect others within their communities to things like this beautiful woman beside me who's constantly connecting people with pathways to help them to reach their goals.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time we're in a position to identify some higher level problems, but really, like you said, we need to get into those communities, bring them to the conversation, have them at the table so they can advocate directly for what they're facing and be part of building that solution. Yeah, thank you. And Victoria, I mean, Erica already alluded to this, but how do you identify and reach marginalized groups?
Yeah, being a part of two marginalized groups, right? Being a Black woman, I feel like I said that like 20 times already. But being a Black woman, I already have access to those communities because I live that life. And so I get to get a firsthand account. And I think Eric had like really spoke about that already, like going to someone who has the skills or has access to that community already and supporting them and kind of empowering them to do more work or possibly giving them funding to do that work, right? I think that's really important. But that's all a part of research. If you're doing work in these communities, you have to do the research. If it's, maybe it's the firsthand, maybe it's surveying these communities, even though I have my firsthand experiences in the community that I'm in, I still survey the people that we support and our beneficiaries because things are always changing. People have different needs. And they need different resources. So surveying them and kind of hearing feedback from them and then course correcting because they may say, this totally doesn't work for me, just did the program. And a lot of filmmakers, I know specifically from working with them for so long, they didn't want their content out because they usually go to festivals and submit their content all the time. And if they have, people have access to their content, they're not able to possibly get a deal with Amazon or Netflix. So they kind of want to have gated content. And so we actually had a tipping party, which is really cool. Erica helped. We're like best buds, right? We're like talking about each other all the time. But yeah, actually helped having this tipping party. And it was a way for the community to kind of get engaged, but for them to share their work in a way that made sense for them. So listening to the community that you want to support and possibly if you don't directly connect with someone who's already doing the work, surveying that community and hearing from all their voices about what they need.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important, which is collecting feedback and incrementally building on that feedback, because we often don't get to have all the answers up front, and if we try to do that and build just with that information, it's really easy to lose sight of what the actual problems are. So I think that's a really great point to highlight. And Carl, I'll ask you, how do you illustrate the challenges that underserved communities face to those who might not be facing the same issues?
I think people's authentic voice is like the most powerful tool, so this notion of like nothing for us without us, which speaks to some of the creators like having work and then wanting to also be engaged in solutions. And so I think it's absolutely critical that if somebody's at the table and whatever we're building is impacting them, then they have to have a part of the process. You have to just be able to connect to those communities and get their feedback. And I think we did a program in Burkina Faso that was like a good example of this, where we were there working on sexual and reproductive health issues. We employed about 100 young people. We trained them in content creation, in technology, in journalism, marketing, like everything you would need to kind of do a campaign. But we didn't begin, this is not like a top-down kind of patriarchal approach. You're saying, okay, it's like a more humble approach. You say, okay, well, we're here, we have access to capital, we have the resources, we have the mandate, but then we need to in turn go to young people and say, okay, well, what works for you? How would this play out in your community? You know, do these theses actually check out? And so you see a lot of that, lack of diversity in the development space. Oftentimes we're like some of the only black people in the room in Africa. And so, you do see that where it's like, we're not actually stopping and talking and engaging young people. I talk about young people all the time because that's like our focus is like youth. But, I think like youth have a lot to offer in terms of insights, in terms of like what's going to work. And I think they're probably going to be adopters of this type of technology. So it makes sense to talk to young people that are digital natives, that are growing up, that are buying Bitcoin, that are using digital technologies as part of who they are. And so talking to them about payment solutions that solve problems that are unique to them, because of course, they're inheriting, a massive unemployment gap. In South Africa, it's 50%. So you can imagine you've done everything right. I went to school, I did this, I did that, I come out and there's still no jobs. And so that's where you start to have like a lot of disenfranchisement amongst young people. Same thing in Georgia where we had like a $5 billion creative economy and the highest youth unemployment in America operating at the same time. And so, when people are crafting policy, for example, and they're saying, okay, great, we're going to give you a tax incentive to come here and shoot, cool. But with that tax incentive should be requirements for youth employment, diversity, and so forth. And so when you give tax incentives, you don't also give mandates that serve the community, then you wind up with situations like a $5 billion economy and crushing youth unemployment operating in the same exact space at the same time. And so had they said to the community or had they said to young people, hey, we got this massive boom coming by way of a creative economy, what do you need, Because that did not happen, then you have policy that gets made in silos. You have culture and creative work that gets made in silos, and then you have payments that are over here, kind of operating on its own. And so I think, so the real way forward is going to be like, how do those things converge? Same with like social justice is intersectional. It's the same exact situation when you talk about like equity and payment systems and culture, like how all of these things kind of intersect now. I had the chance to do a TV show a couple of years ago, and I was sharing with Tabby, like, really, like, that experience as a creator is what drove me to create Snake Nation, because I'm sitting there, like, I'm at the height of what I'm doing, and you see how disenfranchised you are as a black creator at that height. And then you start to realize, well, damn, there's no power in how we pursue these things. So we have to always take a step back and kind of build infrastructure and really change the dynamic of, like, what's happening. So I think these systems can be incredibly powerful if they're well informed, But we can't build them without the people that they're meant to serve integral in like what we're designing.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is something we've echoed a lot is you really need to involve the people that are affected the most. And I think it's great that you're focusing on youth. I think youth, people who are junior to a space or a field can often be overlooked, but they often are the ones who face the consequences of all the previous decisions the most. So I think speaking to them directly is super important. Thank you. And for Andres, how do you tend to illustrate the challenges that underserved communities face to people who maybe don't face those challenges?
One of the main issues is to show the asymmetry, right? To try to paint a very clear picture of the contrasts, especially if you try to demonstrate the power asymmetries in any issue, really. And for example, people that are disenfranchised in communities that are in periphery, when perhaps in their day-to-day do not realize the extent of that power asymmetry and how they actually, being disenfranchised or victims of a system. So by making those contrasts clear, it's already a step forward in getting change to happen. And in that direction, if you can also not show that only to the people that are disenfranchised, the groups that are underrepresented and so forth, but also to the policymakers that you think you can get their ear to listen a bit to what you're saying, then you can have some transformational change. I do believe that besides all the community work that we can do, we really do need to impact policy as well. And it's very important to have people understand that they're part of a larger ecosystem where major decisions are taken in the policy world, and that what happens there will impact your life eventually. So it's important to have that dynamic relationship, working with the community, empowering people at the base, with exemplary and demonstration effects, but also working over there where the decisions are taken. I think it's very important to do that.
Yeah, I really like the point about really making distinct the different contrasts of what we're facing now and what other different groups are facing and what could happen in the future. I think a lot of the time we don't actually know what's going on right now, and I feel like having to draw that contrast forces us to really tune into what's going on, talk to the people, engage with them, and then moving forward being able to engage with policymakers as well. Thank you. Now we'll think about maybe some unexpected challenges we might face in trying to broaden financial inclusion. So Erica.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different sort of things that sort of I've run into in the last couple of years that have really hit me. One was I had the opportunity to work with the First Nations Tech Council to go in and teach in some Indigenous communities different technology skills. And so the goal of this project was like super exciting to me because it was all about getting the tech skills into the community so that it gave the people within those communities new opportunities to work remotely from their Indigenous lands if they so wish to, or they could go elsewhere to work using those technologies. And so as somebody who in recent years I've been so fortunate that I've got the skills to be working online and to be teaching online and be able to kind of manage my own space and my own time so that if I'm having a bad day or I'm having blaring migraines or things like that, I can kind of work around that schedule. And so I came into this class. It was with the New Channel First Nations in Port Alberni, and I was just there for 2 weeks teaching one of the courses. And it was an insanely intense 2 weeks that really kind of sparked, it really very much pushed my limits of just with the intensity of everything. And I'm looking in that classroom and I'm seeing students in that classroom who are single moms looking after children at home, who are looking after, a loved one who is sick or injured. I'm seeing people who are dealing with chronic fatigue and chronic pain like I've dealt with, only much worse because they don't have access to the same clinic in BC that helps with a lot of that stuff because that clinic is in Vancouver. I'm seeing a gentleman in that classroom who, like me, was dealing with post-concussion syndrome. But again, he didn't have access to the same help that I had. So he was dealing with it in much, much worse circumstances to what I was dealing with. And here with this, I think basically on day 3 of this program, my chronic fatigue was hitting me back, which I normally have well under control these days, but it was hitting me back with a vengeance. And I'm thinking these students are going through 12 weeks of this, where not only do they have what they're doing here during the day, but they've got all those other things at home that they're looking after, plus they've got their homework. And so I said to the Tech Council, this is a digital course. This would make so much more sense if you had the option for students to do this part-time, and even if there was the option to do it online as well, so that they could do more part-time studies and be able to look after all the other things in their lives. And I was told that no, it had to be full-time, it had to be on this intense thing. They were getting in trouble if they missed a morning and things like that. And I'm like, this isn't right. This isn't helpful. And and here I barely survived 2 weeks, and I don't know how I would survive 12 weeks of this, especially as a student that's got all this other stuff at the end of the day. And then, you know, around that time, I actually clued into what was causing the problem, because as a student that's doing my master's, in Canada, there's this student, like there's basically, you can get a grant as a student with disabilities to do your studies. And so I thought, I went to apply for the grant, and I very quickly learned that it was not accessible to me. And the reason why it wasn't accessible to me was because when I was kind of first decided to go back to school, it was after my injuries, and I was going through a hospital program at BC Women's, and I knew and they knew that there was no way I could do a full-time program at that stage of the game. And because I was still learning how to manage everything, we didn't know when I might have a flare-up or something that would set me backwards and need me to take some time off. So I purposely found a program that would allow me to study part-time. It was a program that was designed for part-time, that would allow me to study online. And as it turns out, to access that student grant for students with disabilities in Canada, you can only be in a full-time program. Mm-hmm. And so
pause here.
Oh, sorry.
No, we just got one more question left, and yeah, so I'll have you, we can talk about this afterwards, and we'll probably miss the Q&A if that's okay. So just a few minutes left let's talk about the positives, the exciting milestones in reaching and broadening financial inclusion. So I'll start with you, Victoria.
The positives. Yeah, lots of positives, really focusing on education. We've been doing a lot of things this year. And even though it doesn't feel necessarily maybe like traditionally like financial inclusion stuff, but if you don't educate people about how to maintain the things that they need to maintain to continue to get financing and have a career, then obviously there won't be any financial inclusion. So we've done a game jam, right? There's such a small amount of Black and Brown creators in game development. So being able to increase that by teaching people fun stuff. People love gaming, right? But now they're able to put those skills towards possibly building a career, and then also connecting them with people in the industry as well. Obviously, working with the Interledger grant, we were able to fund a whole bunch of filmmakers and teach them about monetization. And for some of the filmmakers, it was their first time receiving funding. So giving them that validation. Validation is so important. Sometimes you hear a whole bunch of no's. Recently I had a call with someone and they were like, "You're too early as an organization." I'm like, I've been doing this for 6 years though. That's not early. But sometimes just getting that validation after you hear a whole bunch of no's allows you to move forward and go on. So doing these things are like the great things that make me feel great about the work that I'm doing. And it's slowly but surely making an impact.
I'll quickly throw it over to Andres.
Yeah, I think most recently we've had a very, very interesting experience after years of sort of advocating for example, the Central Bank of Mexico, which is probably the most conservative institution in the country, you know, financial capital, bankers, white male dominated and so forth, but also in terms of economic policy, they say, well, economic justice is not an issue for us, you're worried about other things and so on. But now, after a wave around the world that has said, you know, financial inclusion is also an issue. Now even it's a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, you know, financial inclusion. So you start to see some changes there. And just this year, they opened up the regulation for initiatives like ours to take place. It's still, you know, work in progress, especially because the issue is not really on the paper. It's in people's minds. But once we show that we can take some concrete steps, in the direction where we all want to go, we believe that the regulatory change will also accelerate the pace of inclusion. So I think we have seen some interesting developments around the world, and hopefully we can keep the pressure up for that to help us make this possible.
For now, but Carl will give you some time to also talk about some exciting milestones.
I mean, I think, being chosen as a grantee, is massive for us. And you talk about validation, I think you're so used to doing these things on your own, and, you kind of have that muscle. And so when you are part of ecosystems and communities, they're like, hey, you have value. And what I like about just some of the conversations that have been happening here is everyone kind of has pieces to the puzzle. And so I don't think people expected to have it all figured out. And I think oftentimes as a creator, you feel like you need to have it all figured out all the time. And so it's good to be in space where you're like, you know what, I don't know that part of it. I know this part of it, but you may have the answer. And so instead of trying to build, how do you collaborate? And I think that's been probably the most exciting piece, has been able to be a part of this ecosystem, add value. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. All right, well, I'll wrap it up here. I'm sure our lovely panelists here are open to questions when you find us around at the summit. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this panel, and a big round of applause to the panelists.